My father was a gospel preacher his entire adult life, and some of his pre-adult life for that matter. There was a room in his house that was literally lined every inch of available wall space with books. And one of the books that used to be in his library that's now in mine is a book by a couple of writers named Conybeare and Howson. Conybeare and Howson authored a book that's called The Life and Epistles of St. Paul. And it would be an amazing book for everybody in here to have, and if we could just have multiple copies and pass those out to everybody, and we could just flip through that together, there would be a lot we could learn from that one book. But there are several problems with that scenario. One is that this book was actually published in 1908. And another one is that the fine print text of the book runs on for 884 pages. We've got a little over a half an hour. So you see the challenge there. I'm going to try to go fairly quickly through some things, not to necessarily cover everything that we could potentially talk about in Paul's life in detail, but I do hope that one of the takeaways can be just to maybe recapture some sense of the magnitude, the scope of the work that this individual did. See if this will work. Nope, it's not going to. Okay. So what was Saul's resume? Very quick review from Wednesday. He was born in Tarsus, the city in the province of Cilicia. He was a Jew, but with Roman citizenship. He studied under one of the premier rabbis of his day, Gamaliel, in Jerusalem. So he went away to school, went to Jerusalem and studied under Gamaliel. He was a Pharisee, and he was violently opposed to Jesus and his disciples. And yet, he becomes Paul the Apostle. Darrell just touched briefly on something about how this happened. I want to spend just a little bit more time with that as a launching point, you might say, to the rest of what we'll talk about this morning. Paul experienced some events that were completely remarkable in their nature, a series of circumstances that were so unique and so personal that even some of the people who were there with him at the time did not experience them fully exactly the same way that he did. He was a man who had been, as the book of Acts says, breathing threats and murder on his way from Jerusalem to Damascus. Let me see if I can help you out just a little bit. Jerusalem is way down here. Damascus is way up here. This is a distance, from what I understand, of about 135 miles. And he's making the trip from Jerusalem to Damascus. I think he's probably very close to Damascus at the point when a blinding light shines all around him. He falls to the ground. He hears a voice speaking to him that says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul's response is, well, who are you, Lord? And the voice comes back to him, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. But rise and enter the city, and you'll be told what to do. I gather from that maybe he was pretty close to the city already at that point. Those who were with him, Luke tells us, were hearing the voice, but it says they were seeing no one. Don't know what Paul was seeing. Actually, maybe not much at that point, because we know he actually was blind for the next 3 days. But the voice of the Lord gives him directions to go up into the city of Damascus. And the Lord also spoke to a man named Ananias and said, I want you to go over and talk to this man. I want you to explain to him what he needs to do basically to become a Christian. Ananias had heard of Saul of Tarsus, and Ananias was a bit reluctant. Saul was carrying with him letters that would give him authority to go into the Jewish synagogue there in Damascus and bind people and take them back to Jerusalem. Saul was on his way there to find people like Ananias and to take them back to Jerusalem. But the Lord had an explanation for Ananias, and the words of this explanation are really, I think, an amazingly concise overview or preview of much of the rest of the life of Paul. He's a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. There's really a lot that's covered there. This is the description to Ananias about what is going to happen with this man. Paul himself would write later in Galatians chapter 2, I had been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcised, just as Peter had been entrusted with the gospel to the circumcised. For he who worked through Peter for his apostolic ministry to the circumcised worked also through me for mine to the Gentiles. This was truly a life-changing experience for Saul. After 3 days, he was baptized, and Acts chapter 9 and verse 20 tells us that after a little bit of time had passed, that he immediately proclaimed Jesus in the synagogues, saying he is the Son of God. You know, it's occurred to me that as we read through Acts up to this point, we have incidents like that of the Ethiopian treasurer who, through miraculous circumstances, is given a preacher to explain better to him the scriptures. He's baptized and he goes on his way rejoicing. We never hear about him again. Peter, through visions, has explained something about God's plan for Gentiles. Peter goes to Cornelius and preaches to him, and he and his household are baptized. I don't think we ever really hear anything more about Cornelius again. It would be in keeping with the way this book is written so far, up to about chapter 9, if Saul hears the gospel, is baptized, and then goes back home to Tarsus and sets up a little shop and works as a tent maker and lives as a productive Christian, but otherwise just fades into obscurity. But that is definitely not what happens. What happens becomes pretty amazing. Immediately, he proclaimed Jesus in the synagogue, saying, he is the Son of God. Paul himself tells us that he went to Arabia at some point Arabia is this little area right here just to the east of Damascus. We're not told what he did in Arabia, but he went to Arabia, he came back to Damascus, and this occupies a period of about 3 years when Paul was preaching boldly until some of the people there were trying to kill him. And this happened a lot. People there were trying to kill him. And some of the brothers there in Damascus went with him, took him to Caesarea. You'll hear about Caesarea again. They took him from Damascus all the way to Caesarea. And then the presumption is, and in fact we read this just a little bit further on, we have a dotted line that goes up off the screen. He goes back to Tarsus for a while. Okay? That's after a period of about 3 years. While some of this is happening in a city called Antioch, the church is growing. Great things are going on at the church in Antioch. And the man in Antioch named Barnabas goes to Tarsus to get Saul to bring him back to Antioch to help with the work there. So that gets Saul to Antioch. Barnabas and Saul are designated to take some financial aid, apparently, that was collected there in Antioch. Take that down to Judea to provide some famine relief for some of the brothers and sisters in Judea. And then they go back to Antioch. And we're here on the eve of what we frequently hear referred to as Paul's first missionary journey. The Lord spoke to the people in the church there at Antioch and set apart for me Barnabas and Saul. I have work for them to do. And so that's what they did. Now, we do not have time to go through everything that happened at every stop. But I want to go through fairly quickly, in order, I think, the places where Paul visited on this first missionary journey. And we have the second, and we have the third, and it even goes on beyond that. So put on your walking shoes and get a flotation device handy because we're about to travel some. Okay. From now you can see Antioch. From Antioch, they leave through Seleucia and they sail to Cyprus and stop at both ends of the island, Salamis and Paphos. We have stops at both of those places before they continue to travel. By the way, we learned early on that John Mark is with them. They have a traveling companion at first, but they go from Cyprus up to the coast of Pamphylia and a place called Perga, and this is where John Mark decides he's going to turn around and go back home. But Paul, as he's being called now, and Barnabas move on up to Perga. From there, they continued to travel northward to Antioch and Pisidia, and then to Iconium. Here's Antioch up here, and I guess this is the northernmost point on this particular trip. They come down to Iconium, and then they come to another couple of small cities or towns that you've probably heard of. One of them is Lystra. That's next. That's the next stop. This is the occasion where they healed a man who was lame, and the people were just so agog at what had happened here that they call Barnabas Zeus and they call Paul Hermes. They think they're gods, and they treat them as if they're gods. Now, while this is going on here, Jews from Antioch and from Iconium, who were still angry at them for the things they did in those cities, they come down here, they follow them into Lystra and start causing trouble here. This is where Paul was stoned, at least one of the occasions. This is where Paul was stoned and left for dead. But in fashion that becomes almost typical for him, Acts tells us that the next day he got up and went to Derbe. Here they made many disciples. And then this was their turnaround point. They turned around, they retraced their steps, went back through Lystra, Iconium, down to Antioch. From Antioch down to the coast, a little place called Italia. Luke is amazingly detailed with some of the things that he mentions. Italia is right here on the coast, and the dotted line brings us back over here to Antioch. Oh, the blue line, in case you're wondering, this is John Mark leaving them at Perga and traveling back to Jerusalem. I came across, while looking at a variety of things, I came across a project that had been done by some scholars at Stanford University called the Geospatial Network Model of the Roman World. They've done a lot of research which they compiled, and they plotted out maps of Roman roadways, and they plotted out maps of typical sailing routes across the Mediterranean. And then they applied some kind of a model to figure out some interesting statistics about some of the travel that took place. According to the research from this project, this particular trip that we just looked at would have covered about 1,581 miles. And just in terms of the travel time, not time spent stopped in any particular place, but just the amount of time needed to accomplish this travel, they estimated to be about 53 days. Okay? This is what we call that first missionary journey. Paul and Barnabas are back in Antioch. There are some problems going on here that have to do with, so what are our expectations of Jews really? Word is coming from down in Judea that non-Jews have to comply with the Jewish law in order to be a Christian. And so Paul, Barnabas, and some of the others were sent to Jerusalem to confer about this, and then they returned to Antioch to report on it. And that takes us into the middle of Acts chapter 15. And this is where Paul says to Barnabas, let's return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord, and let's see how they are. Well, they had a small difference of opinion about whether to take John Mark with them. So Paul ended up traveling with Silas primarily on this trip. Barnabas bought into the idea, the premise for this trip, and so he took John Mark. Luke doesn't really follow them. Luke follows Paul and Silas. I'm going to go quickly through some of the places where they traveled. They started there in Syria, at Antioch, traveled up through Cilicia, strengthening churches, it tells us. When did we get churches in Cilicia? Probably during the period of time when we don't really know what Paul was doing. But he spent some time back home in the Tarsus, Cilicia area, and I kind of skipped over some of that. But they're visiting and encouraging churches in that region, and this is right up in here. And they're going to really do some traveling now. Back to Derbe. We just heard of that before, only this time they're coming to Derbe from the opposite direction this time. Back to Lystra again. This time in Lystra, they encounter Timothy, and he becomes a traveling companion. An interesting thing happens here. He goes to Iconium, then to Antioch. Iconium, Antioch, and then Paul kind of thinks, well, maybe I want to go up here into Galatia and this region here between Galatia and Bithynia called Phrygia. Maybe I want to go and do some preaching there and up in Bithynia. But the Holy Spirit told him no. Didn't let him go up there. So that kind of changed the plan a little bit. So instead, they traveled on over to Troas, which is way over here on this little part of the coast. And now they're going to have to take a ferry, I guess, to move on to Samothrace, which is a little island right here. They're sailing past this area, land at Neapolis, and then right next door to Neapolis is a place you've heard of before called Philippi. Several things happen in Philippi that we're pretty familiar with. This is where the Philippian jailer was converted. This is where Paul met Lydia. She was from Thyatira, by the way, which is way over here. So she had traveled quite a bit for Paul to meet her where he did. From there, they moved through Amphipolis and Apollonia to Thessalonica. You've heard of Thessalonica. And from there, they go to Berea. You've heard of Berea. And from there, they go to Athens. You've heard of all of these places, most likely. There are significant events that are recorded in Luke that occurred in all of those places. Paul's preaching in the synagogue was generally effective in Thessalonica, but there were some jealous Jews that started a major uproar there. The brethren sent Paul and Silas away, apparently for their own safety. They move on to Berea, and Thessalonians came to Berea to cause trouble. Paul was escorted on to Athens while Silas and Timothy stayed there in Berea for a while longer. And in Athens is where Paul spoke at the Areopagus and was somewhat successful with that preaching. From Athens, Paul went to another place we've heard of, that's Corinth. From here over to here, Athens to Corinth. Corinth is where he meets Aquila and Priscilla. His preaching at the synagogue was generally rejected, but the leader of the synagogue, named Crispus, was a believer, interestingly enough. And the Lord told Paul that you're safe here, you can stay for a while. So he actually stayed in Corinth for about 1.5 years. Have you ever been on a big trip and just decided to park for 1.5 years? That was Paul's work. From there, he goes by Ephesus. He doesn't really stay long. And then sails from Ephesus all the way back to Caesarea. There on the coast. And then from Caesarea, he goes up to greet the church, which most take to be a reference to the church at Jerusalem. And then he returns to Antioch. Approximately 3,050 miles, and could have taken about 100 days of just travel time. The third missionary journey, the way Luke writes it, we just kind of slide right on into this and says he departed and went from one place to the next, strengthening the churches. Main stops here definitely include Ephesus. This time he stayed for about 2 years and 3 months in Ephesus. Through Macedonia and Greece, and then turned back around. Macedonia and Greece are over here, but then he turned back around and came back to Troas. And on this occasion at Troas, this is where Eutychus fell out of that 3rd-story window. Paul brought him back to life. That happened at that particular place. From Assos, which is a port, Luke tells us some of the complications, but basically Paul hooked up with his traveling companions at Assos, which is so tiny this map didn't show it. To Mytilene, they sail by Chios and Samos, end up at Miletus, so they're headed back toward home now. Chios, Samos, Miletus, and then they're going to sail on down this way and land at least a little while at Patara, then to Tyre and Ptolemais, which are way back over here now on the coast of Palestine. So a lot of sea to cover. From there down to Caesarea. And something important happens in Caesarea. This is where Agabus appears and says, if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to be bound. And he illustrates that with a little object lesson for Paul. Paul says, I don't care, I'm going to Jerusalem. He was determined to try to get there in time for Pentecost, and so Paul went on to Jerusalem. In case you're keeping track, 3,307 miles and 92 days of just travel time. In Jerusalem, a lot happened. Paul was arrested when Jews caused trouble in the temple. Military officer took Paul into custody. Paul asked for and was given the opportunity to speak to the crowd. Of course, that got the crowd in an uproar eventually. So the tribune took Paul back into custody, and then the next day, Paul was taken to speak to the Sanhedrin. And Paul caused a tumult with the Sanhedrin when he mentioned Pharisee, and said it was because of his belief in the resurrection that there was all this trouble, and we had Pharisees and Sadducees, and there's another big uproar. And so the tribune, partly for Paul's own safety, is my inference, sent Paul to Felix, who is the governor. Felix had a hearing, but he delayed his decision, and Felix goes out of office and Festus comes in. Paul's still left there in jail in Caesarea. Festus has a hearing, or a semblance of one, and says, well, why don't we send you back to Jerusalem? Paul doesn't want to talk to the Sanhedrin again. They want to kill him. Felix and Festus don't really see any reason for this kind of punishment for Paul. And Paul plays his Roman citizenship card and says, well, I want to be heard by Caesar. Paul appeals to Caesar. Agrippa comes for a visit. This is Agrippa II. He's king of this territory at this moment. And he hears Paul. He agreed. There's no reason to punish this man, but he appealed to Caesar. We kind of have to get him to Caesar. And so this was the next step. But just think for a minute about what the Lord had told Ananias, what Paul was going to do. He was going to proclaim the gospel to kings. And here in a fairly short period of time, over maybe a couple of years possibly, Paul talks to 2 Roman governors and a king about the gospel. Every time there's a hearing. To get him to Caesar, to Rome, it's an arduous trip. You can see the red line starting in Caesarea, coming up and across the Mediterranean. They get to Crete and then begin to sail over this way. And here's where they encounter that awful storm. And they're hammered and battered for 14 days. And finally crash the ship on this little island called Malta. And I think they winter or spend about 3 months here before they can begin to sail again and come up through this way. And finally we get Paul to Rome. This trip, just to get Paul to Rome, was not a short trip. This was about another 1,800 miles, and if we hadn't had a 2-week storm, might have taken about 23 days. We also have some evidence that there may have been other travels of Paul after his roughly 2-year Roman imprisonment, and I've just kind of flashed some locations and some passages of scripture up here to support the possibility that there may have been another journey. In Rome, he probably stayed in prison for about 2 years, and this is kind of where Luke leaves him. But secular history suggests that he was there for about 2 years and was released. He may have been to some of these other places. And in Nicopolis, the place is a place where he may have been arrested, taken to Rome, and beheaded, maybe somewhere between the years 64 and 68. Does that make you tired?
Bruce, given all the luxuries that we have in our nation, comforts, and we thank the Lord that we have a comfortable place to meet and all that sort of thing. I can't help but think of the fact I would have difficulty considering that kind of life, knowing beforehand, all the things I would suffer, because that's what he was told.
Yes.
You must tell him all the things he's going to suffer for me. And he knew at every city what awaited him in the next one. And still faithfully went on.
I don't know that this is always true, but I started to get the feeling as I was reading through some of this for this class, that it seemed like the more effective he was in some places, the more likely that was to generate animosity also. So you do a great job with your preaching, you start to convert Jews, other Jews get angry, and they run you out of town, or they stone you. Stop after stop.
Who of us have experienced that? Being run out of town.
Not for that kind of reason. There are 4 things that occurred to me that I just wanted to mention, and the little time that we have left, this will just have to be a brief mention. But in trying to think about how would we maybe summarize Paul's, for lack of a better term, I just thought of this as his work ethic, his attitude about the work that he did. He was a planter. He also did a lot of encouraging, but he seems to have seen his mission as that of a planter. In 1 Corinthians 3:6, he says, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. He says in another place that he was all things to all people. To the Jews I became as a Jew, to those outside the law I became as one outside the law, to the weak I became weak. He, within the bounds of God's will, he accommodated himself to his audience. He was bold, but he was not conceited. In fact, he was given a thorn in the flesh to help ensure that. And he had great confidence in God's grace and what that meant for him. He said, when it comes to living or dying, dying would be better. How many of us would say that? But he said, you guys need me. So I guess I'll live a little bit longer. There's an excellent summary in 2 Corinthians 11 of all of his hardships here, if you want to look that up. I want to put in a real quick plug for a handout that Darrell has put together showing a timeline of Paul's life. It's available on the table back here. I've not even tried to address the issue of dates. Every timeline you see is a little bit different, but the one you'll get back there is the best annotated I've seen anywhere. So pick up one of those if you haven't already. Thank you.